Hey guys, it's the VC Andrews Critiquer. No song introduction this time. Anyway, let me ask you all a question. What story involves a kid who feels unappreciated by their family, decides to get away from them for a little while by going to New York City, finds a nice place to stay by duping all the adults who work there with ingenious stories and strategies to make them think they have adult supervision, but eventually gets homesick and decides to go home, but not before righting an injustice. Most of you probably guessed Home Alone 2, and you're technically right, but 27 years before that movie came out, there was another story that had that exact same premise, that being The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. By the way, I know the quality for the original is pretty bad here, but it was literally the only version I could find online. You just gotta make do with what you got. Anyway, here's the recap. 12-year-old Claudia is in a state of depression. She finds her family to be a group of idiots who don't understand or respect her in the slightest. So, hoping to make her parents appreciate her more, she decides to run away from home for a period of time, convincing her little brother Jamie to join her for his good companionship and sense of direction. And not at all because of the fact that he probably has more money saved up than even their parents do from being a skilled poker player that she could easily live off of while she's gone. No, that's ridiculous. So anyway, the two half-pints head off to New York City and hide down the Metropolitan Museum of Art, coming up with Home Alone-like stories to fool every adult they come across into thinking they're just innocent tourists. So they try to make the exhibits their home for a while, but eventually discover one piece that was sold to the museum for only a couple $100 may in fact be from the great Michelangelo. Wanting a piece that may be worth millions to have the recognition it deserves, and hoping their parents will be so pleased with them for making such a discovery that they won't ground them for life, the two seek out to find evidence to prove the artifact's worth. When it looks like their efforts have only been a wild goose chase, Claudia decides that there's only one person who would know for sure. The person who sold the artifact to the museum herself, Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. This story's not a criminally underrated masterpiece of children's literature by any means, nor a book that if you had to read in elementary school, you'd be like, wow, how can an English class book be this entertaining? I'm seeing school from a whole new perspective now. But most of us who have read it do remember it fondly as a nice little story about two siblings surviving without their parents, and one of the earliest examples of kids cleverly duping grown-ups that John Hughes popularized with movies like Ferris Bueller and the Home Alone films. And for an illustration of the siblings bathing butt naked in the fountain. And no, I'm not going to show you that illustration because it's borderline child pornography, and I can't believe a humane publishing company actually allowed it to be used. Just Google it yourself if you want to be disturbed like I was. Anyway, it was popular enough to spawn 2 film adaptations, or 3 if you count the Simpsons parody Smart and Smarter, one theatrical retitled The Hideaways in 1973, and another for TV retaining the original book's title in 1995. While the original book has a couple online reviews, I can't find a single one for these 2 movies, and I figured I might as well do it. So if you'll join me at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I'll be releasing an exhibit comparing and contrasting these 2 adaptations and finding out which one, in my opinion, comes off as superior. This is Old vs. New, The Hideaways vs. The Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler. Okay, so being a relatively simplistic story, I could only find so much to compare with these 2 movies, so this Old vs. New is only going to have 3 rounds instead of the usual 5. But anyway, like said before, our 2 leads seem to be the prototypes in a long line of kids who can dupe adults on the turn of a dime. So which portrayal of one of the earliest examples of this trope comes off as better? Well, let's find out with Best Claudia and Jamie. Our sibling dynamic duo is portrayed by Sally Pager and Johnny Doran in The Hideaways and Gene Barnwell and Jesse Sofer in The Mixed Up Files. Both are very talented pairs of child actors, but of course we have to ask which duo is more dynamic, as far as brothers and sisters are concerned, so let's look at Claudia first. Both depictions are extremely smart, having more ingenious solutions to living in a museum without raising suspicion from the staff than even most grown-ups probably would, not to mention a very impressive knowledge of Renaissance art. I mean, how many kids know that Michelangelo's signature mark is 3 circles? But there are some key differences as well. For instance, while Jean Barnwell plays Claudia as an overall emotionally healthy nerd who's just going through a stage of resentment towards her family, Sally Pager plays her like a sullen goth punk who hates everything in her life.
Sometimes I think it's a curse to be the only girl in the family. The only thing emptying wastebaskets will help me prepare for is to be a janitor. I'm sick of everything now. Kindly leave me alone.
You can really see a natural misery and gloominess in her performance, making it clear that she's been living with this depression and resentment towards her parents for quite a while now. The new Claudia seems like the problems with her family have only been going on for a few days at best, so the fact that she'd want to run away seems kind of like a stretch. The original Claudia definitely seems more like a kid desperate enough to run away if it would earn the respect of her parents. But in spite of the downer persona she shows, she is still pretty likable. Her cynic attitude allows her to have some pretty funny lines.
And you'll need your most elegant pajamas, Sir James. The ones embroidered in gold with silver tassels will do.
And her moody punk stubbornness makes her all the more dedicated to solving the mystery of the sculpture and thus very easy to root for. Sure, the nerdiness of Barnwell's Claudia also makes her endearing, as well as more believable that she'd be so smart for her age, but she just doesn't seem to stick out quite as much as Pager. How about Jamie? Again, both actors do well at capturing the obnoxious but witty little brother persona, but it feels a bit more like a performance from Jesse Sofer in The New. A good performance, but a performance nonetheless. Johnny Dorn, on the other hand, has a natural spunk to him that made him seem more believable. He almost comes off like a 1970s Kevin McAllister.
He was broken in a fight when he was young.
You mean he was a juvenile delinquent?
Fingerprints! Michelangelo lived about 500 years ago.
So, maybe he got arrested for making statues of naked people and they took his fingerprints.
I also like how the age difference between the two is more evident in The Hideaways. The actors in the mixed up files both look about the same age, but Sally Pager and Johnny Dorn both look about the respective ages of their characters. Plus, they bizarrely look a lot like the illustrations of the two in the original book. Kudos to the casting directors. Again, the child actors in the mixed up files give solid performances. I just find the ones in The Hideaways a little stronger as well as more natural. Point goes to The Hideaways.
Nobody appreciates me.
Even though our two leads didn't need help taking care of themselves in the museum, they sure did to solve the mystery of the sculpture, so let's see who was of more support to them with Best Supporting Cast. I guess we should probably start with Mrs. Frankweiler herself, played by Ingrid Bergman and Lauren Bacall. Both versions are wise and willing to assist the children in solving the angel mystery, but also reclusive and not afraid to speak their mind. The only problem I have is that Bergman's portrayal comes off as a little too harsh. I mean, just look at the first thing she says when she meets the kids.
Don't mumble. I dislike mumblers.
I'm not saying the fact that she's blunt is necessarily bad. In fact, you could argue that it works for an old recluse like Mrs. Frankweiler, kind of like how it worked for a moody, unappreciated girl like Claudia. But the problem is that unlike with her, this Mrs. Frankweiler doesn't have enough charm or likability to balance it out. For the most part, she's just a rude old biatch.
I do not make contributions. It was a tax expedient. Enough. I refuse to keep reassuring you. And if you go on with this kind of talk, I shall find you so dull I shall call your parents as well as the police to get rid of you. Is that clear?
But thankfully, that's definitely not the case with Lauren Bacall's Mrs. Frankweiler. She has a lovable, smug charm to go with her introverted bluntness, making her version much more enjoyable.
Oh, well, now we both have a secret. Very interesting. Playing games is fun, isn't it?
But she is also kinder to the children in this version. Not that the original had no kindness at all, but it felt a lot more meaningful here. Like, she seems more interested in the kids and their adventure, where in the original, she mainly just wants to talk about her own life story. Also, compare the scenes that follow after the children leave. In the hideaways, she's like, "We need more staff, Saxenberg. Oh, and what did you think of that Claudia kid?" In the Mixed Up Files, she has a monologue where she says she looks forward to seeing them again soon. Although I do like her butler Saxenberg better in the hideaways, the one in the Mixed Up Files is just the generic forgettable rich person butler, but here he's a bit more eccentric and comedically terrified of his employer's short temper, making him a little more memorable. How about Claudia and Jamie's family? Again, I have to go with the Mixed Up Files. For one thing, they're in the movie a lot more, which I'll go into more detail with in the best story round. In the hideaways, they only appear at the very beginning, and even then, it's kind of hard to tell why Claudia is at her wit's end with them. I mean, there was a brief scene that implied her pop was an imagination-hating stick in the mud, and her other brother was a lazy freeloader, but these scenes aren't quite developed enough for my liking, and the mom was... In the Mixed Up Files, these traits are fleshed out a lot more, also making the mom a nagging control freak who always favors Claudia's brothers. It still feels like these problems have only been going on for a short period of time, but at least we know more about what these problems are here. I also like how Claudia's other brother is older than her in this version, which gives Claudia a middle child stress problem. And the museum employees? Well, we see many more of them in the Mixed Up Files, but the only one that's even somewhat fleshed out is this dim-witted security guard the siblings keep running into and goes after them when the jig is up. Although kudos to the hideaways for having a Madeline Kahn cameo as a school teacher on a field trip. So factoring all that in, it looks like the Mixed Up Files has the better supporting cast. Point goes to the Mixed Up Files.
You have the soul of a bookkeeper.
Once again, it's all tied up, so now let's look at the final piece of evidence to crack the mystery about which adaptation comes off as better, the best story. This is Story for the Win. A story about two runaway kids hiding out in a museum while attempting to prove a sculpture there was from Michelangelo may not be the most revolutionary idea concocted, but with good execution, it can make a nice family film, and the execution in both movies is a bit different. Despite being a little longer, The Hideaways tells the story fairly simplistically, while The Mixed Up Files goes into more detail. But is less more, or is the more the better? Well, let's take a look. Like said before, we see a lot more of the kids' family in the new than in the old, frantic with worry about the kids and trying to find them. Granted, these scenes aren't vital to the story, but I think they are important to show the kids that their parents do love them and want them in their lives.
Claudia and Jamie, if you ran away like your letter says, please come home. We're having a very hard time without you.
Not to mention, they make the third act a little more exciting when they figure out the kids are at the museum and try to find them along with the staff. The kids miss their parents and want to go home, but they're so close to cracking the angel mystery and can't leave just yet, so they have to evade them and just barely get away. And it is more refreshing to see them pick up the kids from Miss Frankweiler's house instead of just having her chauffeur drive them home. Speaking of which, we also see Mrs. Frankweiler herself a couple times before her main appearance in the third act, donating the sculpture to the museum in the prologue, and also meeting the kids briefly in the museum when the exhibit first goes on display, and seeming like she knows damn well who they are. The Hideaways mainly stays within the perspective of Claudia and Jamie, which isn't necessarily bad because it is their story, and the writers gave them a ton of fun things to do and say, so we don't get bored sticking with them for most of the movie.
Chocolate Alka-Seltzer. Just put some chocolate syrup in a glass, then put in water and some Alka-Seltzer.
It's your stomach, kid.
But it does kind of deprive the other characters a chance to properly shine in the movie. The Mixed Up Files also adds a couple other segments that help strengthen the story. Like in The Hideaways, Jamie is persuaded by Claudia to go with her to the museum pretty easily, which doesn't seem especially believable since he's not the one having family problems. In The Mixed Up Files, Jamie agrees when he finds out his parents are dumping him and his siblings with an aunt they hate for the weekend to get some peace from their bickering, and had the gall to give them sundaes the previous night to butter them up for it. This gives Jamie a little more of a motive to want to join Claudia on the expedition. Also, compare how Claudia reaches out to a historian about the evidence she and Jamie found about the sculpture, and he tells her it's not enough to prove it came from Michelangelo. In The Hideaways, they just correspond via mail, but in The Mixed Up Files, Claudia actually dresses up like a grown-up and schedules an appointment for the two to meet. A little corny, sure, but it works better since film is a visual medium. Show, don't tell. But thankfully, The Hideaways does have some understanding of that as well, as even though its story is more simplistic, it is more visually stunning than The Mixed Up Files. We have a lot more shots in New York City and some of the museum's finest pieces, and even the more mundane locations like the forest the kids are playing in at the very beginning are shot from some pretty damn nice sections and angles. The last thing I want to talk about is how Mrs. Frankweiler reveals whether or not the angel is from Michelangelo, and in case you're wondering, yes, it is. In The Hideaways, Mrs. Frankweiler asks Claudia which file she thinks the document indicating the answer is stored under. After a few unsuccessful guesses, Mrs. Frankweiler asks Claudia if her reason for running away and trying to solve this mystery was because she felt second-rate compared to her brothers and hoped her parents would respect her more if she did. Claudia tries to deny it, but then miserably admits she's absolutely right. Mrs. Frankweiler pities her and then shows her where the file is. While this was an emotional and well-acted scene, I think the one in The Mixed Up Files is a little more creative and climactic. Since the kids have been hiding for so long, Mrs. Frankweiler decides to go with said theme and give the kids 1 hour to locate the evidence in her file cabinets, or else she's phoning their parents. When the kids are near the hour mark with no luck, and Jamie comments on how he thinks this is all baloney, Claudia remembers reading in a book that the sculpture was made in the Italian city of Bologna, and sure enough, the evidence is in the Bologna file. In many cases, less is more, but this is not one of them. Even though there's some good gags and nice visuals in The Hideaways, the more developed plot of The Mixed Up Files just makes it more dramatic, more believable, and ultimately, the better movie. Point goes The Mixed Up Files, the ultimate winner.
It was all for nothing.